So this meeting will basically go through how to answer the DBQ in the old way of doing things, but mostly look at some of these documents to make sure you know how to actually utilize them. And looking at the 2016 released questions here, give me a yes, I see it. If you see the immigration in the United States by decade, just at least somebody kind of give me a yes.
I see it.
Yes.
Okay. So this would be number one of the short answer questions. Now, obviously, the administration of the AP test this year is not going to include short answers. However, since they use a STEM, this is exactly where they get their DBQ stems from as well. It's kind of a bank of old questions, if you will. So this immigration to the United States graphic has been used in other AP examinations, you know, back in the 1980s and 90s. So they just kind of recycle these things. So let's say you get a DBQ where they throw this at you. The first thing you should look whenever you get a visual like this is there a source? Now, as you notice, there is no source here. It doesn't say that this was taken from the United States Census Bureau or that it was taken from, you know, a cataloging of, you know, the Fortune magazine or something like that. So you always should look to see if there's a source. If there isn't, then they're just using a visual like this to give you straight up data. And this, at that point, you're just assuming that there is no purpose in them presenting this to you. There's no viewpoint. It's just, this is the data. So what can we deduce from this? It's asking immigration or stating immigration in the United States by decade between 1820 and 1859. So this is kind of the whole point with this. And for those of you, and you're here because you're taking the AP exam, the smart thing to do, and I've been thinking about this for the last week or so, the smart thing to do if you're going to have notes next to you is to have a basic timeline so that you can quickly identify where these things place in the timeline of American history. Now, if I look at 1820 to 1859, and I've got my timeline, I would notice that this is from the antebellum. This is before the Civil War. So before the Civil War ever happened, this is what they're talking about. The immigration went up every decade leading up to the Civil War, and it went up almost exponentially prior to the Civil War. That's what I'm getting just by looking at it. So in the 1820s, we didn't have millions of people coming here. We still didn't have millions in the 1830s. But by the 1840s, we were over that. Okay, we were getting 1 million people plus per decade. And of course, we were almost to 3 million per decade by the 1850s. So when you got this for the short answer question in 2016, they asked you to briefly explain how one major historical factor contributed to the change depicted on the graph. Now, you could take this a whole host of different ways. The easiest route is that they're trying to get you to say that we were using more and more of mechanized industrial style, you know, manufacturing, if you will, that we were becoming a more manufacture-based society. Now, another historical effect that would have resulted is the growth in cities. That all of a sudden New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and even Atlanta to certain extents were growing and prospering because of the new emphasis on industry. And even though we didn't hit the true industrial revolution in the United States until the 1860s and 70s after the Civil War, we were producing things and we were using newer technologies. The railroad had come along during that time period. That's what they're kind of getting out of this. So what you should get from these infographics here is, all right, they're talking about immigration, but in reality, they're talking about what is the impact of immigration or what is the causation of immigration. There's always some link here, okay? And of course, they're asking you, what is another specific historical effect? And I just mentioned the railroads. You know, you could take this about 1 million different ways. You could talk about the growth in the eastern seaboard being more population dense, meaning they were moving to the cities and the environs around that, because farmers were no longer really large scale productions in New England. The farmers during the 1830s and 40s were the immigrants going out west and settling in what is today Ohio and Pennsylvania, and even farther west than that. You can talk about manifest destiny. You can talk about how since we added territory out west, or we added Texas during the 1830s, and of course manifest destiny throughout the 1840s, you can talk about those additions of territories causing people to want to come here. So all of that can be tied to the immigration, if you will. All right, so that's what they're trying to get you to do when you get a visual. Okay, they didn't give you one on number 2 here. And number 3, they gave you these two historians and what they're talking about. Matthew Josephson, historian, 1934. So now you've got a historian, but where's he talking? He's talking about 1934. Anybody tell me what's happening in the United States in 1934 at that time?
The Great Depression.
There you go. You got the Great Depression is happening during that time period. Okay. So you always have to keep that in mind that, hey, Josephson's talking at a time period where the economy isn't great. All right. And this is at the very early stages of the New Deal, when FDR has come in and he's had his first 100 days by that point. The New Deal is in full swing, but it's still very early in the Great Depression. And so, of course, the document says they were aggressive men, as were the first feudal barons. Sometimes they were lawless in important crises. Nearly all of them tended to act without those established moral principles which fix more or less the conduct of the common people of the community. These men were robber barons, as were their medieval counterparts, the dominating figures of aggressive economic age. Under their hands, the renovation of our economic life proceeded relentlessly. Large-scale production replaced the scattered, decentralized mode of production. Industrial enterprises became more concentrated, more efficient technically, and essentially cooperative, where they had been purely individualistic and lamentably wasteful. All right, so he is very much talking at that point about a time period that we talked about in this class in the late 1800s. He's talking about the robber barons and the captains of industry of the Gilded Age. Now, H.W. Brands, who is a current historian, as you note, he wrote in 1999. And in 1999, he wrote about the captains of industry as well. And he wrote, what really lifted the giants above the rest was the ability to envision where the world, or their part of it, was going, and to act on that vision in a creative way. From the days of Adam Smith, self-interest has been acknowledged driving force of capitalism. The secret of the market system is that one person's self-interest can simultaneously serve the interests of others. Buyers and sellers, producers and consumers, investors and entrepreneurs take reciprocal advantage of each other. Success rewards those who can discover or create areas of reciprocity. The larger the area, the greater the success. They were the captains of industry, but like officers of volunteer regiments, they held their posts at the sufferance of those they led. All right. So these historians are both talking about the same time period. All right. They're both talking about the late 1800s, and they're both talking about economic development during that time period. So, of course, in the short answer section, they would be asking things like, briefly explain one major difference between their historical interpretations of business leaders who rose to prominence between 1865 and 1900. Now, the answer to that is, you will notice that Josephson called them something different than Brands. Josephson called them, for the lack of better terminology, robber barons. That was a negative term. Okay. But yet, Brands calls them captains of industry. That was considered a positive term. Weirdly enough, though, and this is where the AP board and why they chose these, Josephson's talking about, yes, they were robber barons, but they were centralizing things. They were bringing things into cities. So, for example, Pittsburgh is known as the Steel City. Cincinnati is known as Porkopolis. All these cities had some product that they were known for. So, and that was because of these people centralizing those industries, centralizing the meat packing, centralizing the steel production, centralizing rail units, whatever the case may be. So Josephson's talking about, hey, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's more efficient. Whereas Brands is saying, yeah, he's using the term that's positive, and yet he's talking about, yeah, they did all these really creative things, but at the expense of those that they led, at the sufferance of those they led. So the people that worked for them didn't benefit the same way. So again, a major difference between these is the use of language, but the College Board is actually asking you to go beyond that to realize the differences between their perception of those terms. Then it says briefly explain how one person, event, or development from the period that is not explicitly mentioned in the excerpts could be used to support Josephson's interpretation. All right, so he talked about centralizing, and the easiest route, if you talk about Pittsburgh at that point, is to mention Carnegie, to go after Carnegie and saying he centralized the steel production of the United States within the steel city of Pittsburgh. He brought together an entire industry under his control. You could also bring up Rockefeller too and talk about how Rockefeller centralized oil production in Cleveland. You could talk about how JP Morgan centralized banking in New York City. You can talk about how Vanderbilt centralized control over the railroads. You could talk about any number of those people who would have been considered a robber baron. For that same exact reason, you could also talk about Brand's interpretation. And Brand talking about captains of industry, you could say, and Carnegie also counts here because Carnegie had the Homestead strike in 1892. That technically was on his watch. That was his company, and he wasn't exactly paying these people the proper amount of money. He wasn't compensating them. So needless to say, you could go and use the same person to go two separate ways. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is to illustrate the fact that when you get a DBQ, and I have a strong feeling this could happen this time around since they're limiting it to only 5 documents, they might actually include in those 5 documents 2 perceptions of the exact same concept, where you could kind of fence it and talk about how Carnegie could be one, but he could also be the other. You can do the same thing with presidents. You could do the same thing with congressional bills, congressional law. You could talk about Supreme Court cases the same way. So do realize right now, the reason I'm kind of going through this and talking about this one specifically is because historians tend to disagree, especially in different time periods. Now, why do I bring up Josephson, 1934? He's talking about how, yeah, they made it more efficient. But what did that gradually lead to? Okay, where they had been purely individualistic and lamentably wasteful. You know, he's criticizing it at the same time. Brands in the 1990s, better economy. He's talking about, hey, these Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, which was kind of the capitalist Bible, where he talked about an invisible hand guides the market. In 1999, during Bill Clinton's term in office, the reason Clinton was held up as being a good president during the 1990s is the economy was booming. Everything was fine. People were making money. So Brands is writing with a different perspective. Josephson's writing at a time where the economy's not all that great. So he's using negative terminology while still bringing up a fair point about these guys. Brands is writing in a good economy using positive terminology, but yet talking about how they really didn't help people in the long run. So that's basically what you can do with these different stems, if you will, that are going to be part of your DBQ. You can kind of point out point of view, if you will. If this were a DBQ thing, you'd be talking about Josephson writing during the Great Depression and Brands writing during a time period of economic prosperity. Now, do they expect you to know that straight up? Not necessarily, but remember, in this time around, they're only asking, they're going to be limited on, instead of 7 documents, you only have 5. So instead of saying, hey, you need to know the point of view of 3 of them, they're probably only going to need the point of view of 2. So if you see a document where like, man, I don't know where this comes from, that's still okay. Just figure out where the point of view or the argument is coming from the others. Okay. And of course, there was no STEM question for question 4 here. Now that brings us up to the DBQ. Now, again, the DBQ, and keep in mind they have, I'm going to take you off here. All right. So you should have on your own computers the actual document that I was just going through, the 2016 AP US free response questions. Okay. So if you have not brought that up, try and bring that up and split screen it, or just, kind of toggle back and forth. And of course, you don't need to see me to actually go through this, but I'm going to go through document 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then I'm going to go through the actual worksheet here with you to make sure you understand what I mean by this. So we're going to fill this out together. Okay. We're going to do this all together. You have every right to ask questions. You can do the chat function if you don't feel like unmuting your mic. If you want to unmute it and ask a question, you can interrupt me at any time. This is not like a lecture by any stretch. So feel free to ask questions. Does anybody have any questions about what I just went over with the primary sources? Okay. So 7 documents are presented here. The 7 documents on the DBQ. We're going to start with document 1. And I want to make sure, by the way, the College Board said the other day that they would want every one of you to take the original test, like the first test on May 15th. So your test date is May 15th at 2 p.m. All right. So the other one I gave you later on is actually the makeup test date now. Okay. So they were kind of flying by the seat of their pants. They didn't make it very clear. They have since made it very clear. They want you all to take the first administration, and you're going to want to do that in May, because on May 15th, I guarantee it'll be an easier version of the test. Okay. Whatever they have on the back burner for June is not going to be a good test option for many of you. Take the May 15th. So clear your calendar on Friday, May 15th at 2 p.m. for 45 minutes to an hour to make sure that you get your AP stuff done. Okay. So again, and we'll kind of go over that as we go through, not just today, but leading up to the actual test. We'll go through some test taking tips, and certainly how to be more efficient in your prep and more efficient in your assistance. Don't just have a binder full of notes next to you and your textbook. Actually try and sink it down into a much more manageable chunk of material, and we'll go over that. But let's go through the AP DBQ here. We're going to start with document 1 after we look at the question. Okay, so the question is, explain the causes of the rise of women's rights movement in the period of 1940 to 1975. Now, I want to make very clear, the reason I chose this DBQ to start off is this is not testable material. Okay, this is outside of testable material. They're not going to ask you a question like this on the modern either modern civil rights or modern women's movement or anything. They can't. They can only go up to 1945. All right. So just to make sure everybody's clear on this, you are only responsible for unit 1 through 7. Now, every DBQ I give you from this point on is going to be from 1 through 7. But I gave you a more modern one this time around because I'm walking you through it step by step so that you can see how it's done, so that you can practice. So the next time we do one of these, you're going to participate a little bit more. Okay. So hopefully you understand what I'm saying here. This time I'm walking you through it step by step to make sure you understand how to read this stuff, because this is not the testable material. From now on, we're actually going to use this as a practice version. So I didn't expect anybody to walk in with any of these the Google Docs filled out. I did not expect you to have that filled out. What I do expect from now on is you at least to look through this and try and do it beforehand, so that we can kind of walk through and see where maybe you were having issues, maybe you made a mistake or whatever else, and we can fix it. So the cause of women's rights movement in a period of 1940 to 1975. Okay. Now, on your DBQ sheet, you will notice that it says that you should have the source or the author, the information from the document, and the point of view or argument. This is the stuff that you need to derive from the DBQ documents and the question all the way through. So we're going to do the documents first, okay? Document 1, source. Victory waits on your fingers, keep 'em flying, Miss USA, produced by the Royal Typewriter Company for the United States Civil Service Commission, 1942. Okay? So obviously, This is a piece of propaganda. Victory waits on your fingers. Keep them flying, Miss USA. And it's courtesy of the National Archives. So this was actually produced by the U.S. Civil Service Commission in Washington, D.C. back in 1942. So if I'm filling this out on the documents here, what is the source? It's literally the United States Civil Service Commission. Okay? That's where it's coming from. So what can we deduce from that? This is a government document. This is obvious government propaganda. Okay? What information can we glean from this? Looking at the picture, what are we trying to get at here? Anybody want to unmute and take a whack at this one?
Is it saying how like women need to like produce more sort of pro-war, pro-soldiers sort of propaganda in the newspapers?
Okay, sort of. You're not too far off.
Is it talking about how women need to enter the workplace because there's not as many men around?
Okay, so this one would be actually, yes, they need to go work for, and you can see Uncle Sam needs stenographers. Stenographers are people that take dictation. Somebody says, hey, write, take a letter, and then they start typing it out. Okay, that's a stenographer. So they need people, women, to enter the workforce. Now, what are they doing? We're asking you to type. That's what we're asking you to do. Keep men flying. So what are they saying? Keep men going off to war by taking their jobs here at home. If you can do the job that a man is doing, then you can free them up to go serve the country, to go into the armed forces. And of course, when we're talking about Miss USA, we're talking about young women. Young women. And does this woman look like she can actually do hard labor here? No. She's not being recruited to go into the factory. She's not being recruited to go and work on the dockyards. She's being recruited to work in an office complex, to go to work every day, dress nicely, neat hair, clean, and just type. That's what she's being asked to do. So the info we can glean from this is that women are being asked to serve their country by joining the workforce. Now, what is the point of view? The simple answer to that is this is propaganda. This is the United States government trying to fight the war in a different methodology. That, if men are off fighting, then the women need to do the work at home. Okay? So this is asking women who typically wouldn't be working to go out and leave the home and work. Okay? And the key to this one as well, that if you're going to talk about point of view, the propaganda is aimed at unmarried females. Okay? What's the connotation? What else are you doing? You're not taking care of a family. You're not dating anyone because they're all off fighting. Spend your time here typing. You can serve your country much better than just existing. And so what is the connotation? These women were not expected to work beforehand, even though they're not married. And even though they're not with children, they were not expected to work. Now they're expected to work. So the changing connotation here of what the women's place in the workforce and the country is present here in this. Okay. Document 2, Betty Friedan, UE, United Electrical Radio and Machine Works of America, fights for women workers, 1952. All right. Does anybody know who Betty Friedan is? Okay, the silence is deafening. Betty Friedan is, and obviously many of you have not watched the very boring PowerPoints that I put out there about the modern era. Betty Friedan is a women's rights advocate who wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. In it, she questioned every single traditional expectation of women. She questioned why women were being told that they had to go start families and take care of the kids. Why is it that the woman's place is in the home? And she attacked pretty much every part of it. She attacked the idea that women were supposed to be virtuous, whereas men could be coarse and foul and vain. And why is it that women have to represent that in American society? She questions Republican motherhood. She questions women, becoming, if women went into the workforce, she questions, why is it they always have to be secretaries? Why do they have to be teachers? Why can't they be research scientists? Why can't they be doctors? Why do they have to have gender specific roles? So she really kind of questions that. And she questions women's places, not just in the workplace, but also in society. Why is it women can't be sexual comparative to men? Why can men have certain sexual expectations, but women cannot? So her book was considered not just groundbreaking, but also very controversial. So not surprisingly, they're going to include her into something like this. Now, Betty Friedan says in there, in advertisements across the land, industry glorifies the American woman in her gleaming GE kitchen, at her Westinghouse laundromat, before her Sylvania television set. Nothing is too good for her unless she works for GE or Westinghouse or Sylvania or thousands of other corporations throughout the United States. As an employee, regardless of her skill, she is rated lower than the common labor, male. She is assigned to jobs which, according to government studies, involve greater physical strain and skill than many jobs done by men, but she is paid less than the underpaid sweeper, the least skilled men on the planet. She is speeded up until she may faint at her machine to barely earn her daily bread. Wage discrimination against women workers exists in every industry where women are employed. It exists because it pays off in billions of dollars in extra profits for the companies. According to the 1950 census, the average wage for women in factories was $1,285 a year less than men. In just 1 year, U.S. corporations made $5.4 billion in extra profits from their exploitation of women. So obviously, if you're going to fill out the form here, what's the source? It's Betty Friedan. The information from the document, what is she saying?
Women are being asked to join the workforce, but are then being abused within it.
Are they being asked to join the workforce?
Well, they're already in it and they're being abused within it.
Okay, so wouldn't you make the argument at this point that they're being discouraged?
Yes.
Okay. Obviously, if I hired two of you to do the same job, let's say I hired Chris and Francis to do a job, and I said, Chris, you're going to be making $15 an hour. Francis, you're going to be making $11, and they're doing the same job. What am I really saying to Francis by doing that? I'm saying I don't really particularly value you at this place of business, and I'm hoping you move on to another job. Okay. It's a way of getting rid of people or exploiting people for working, just as hard for less money. Okay. So even if they don't want the women to leave, they're certainly exploiting their gender to make a profit. So what is the viewpoint or point of view of Betty Friedan? Obviously, she's making the argument at this point that this is wrong and that the government should do something to step in because these corporations are obviously not. Okay. Why would that be somewhat controversial during the 1950s to bring up the government getting involved?
Is it because of the Cold War?
Cold War communism. Government stays out, right? So this is that whole capitalism versus communism argument. So Betty Friedan saying, hey, somebody should step in to do something about this. Who can? If corporations, if businesses aren't going to do it, then the government would have to. And this is not a time period. I mean, she's writing this during the time period of Joseph McCarthy. Okay. And Joseph McCarthy, in case you haven't watched the PowerPoints or kept up, Joseph McCarthy was a senator from Wisconsin who accused people within the government of being communist sympathizers or spies. And it started another Red Scare during the 1950s. And this one was way worse than the one in the 1920s. In the 1950s, there were legitimately people that lost their jobs, lost their homes, lost their marriages because they were named as a communist, a suspected communist. Okay. So Betty Friedan is not exactly on safe ground by kind of proposing this. All right. So this would be considered to be somewhat controversial. Okay. Speaking of controversial here, source, Sex and Caste, a kind of memo from Casey Hayden and Mary King to a number of other women in peace and freedom movements, 1965. Women we've talked to who work in peace and civil rights movements seem to be caught up in common law caste system that operates sometimes subtly, forcing them to work around or outside hierarchical structures of power which may exclude them. Women seem to be placed in the same positions of assumed subordination in personal situations too. It is a caste system which, at its worst, uses and exploits women. The caste system perspective dictates the roles assigned to women in peace and civil rights movement, and certainly even more to women outside the movement. Within the movement, questions arise in situations ranging from relationships of women organizers to men in the community, to who cleans the Freedom House, to who holds the leadership positions, to who does secretarial work, and who acts as spokesperson for other groups. Other problems arise between women with varying degrees of awareness of themselves as being as capable as men, but held back from full participation, or between women who see themselves as needing more control of their work than other women demand. So again, this is a memo written by these two women talking about women's place in social movements. So the source would be these people, these two. It's a memo, obviously. And then we're talking in 1965, so this would be knee deep within the feminist movement of the 1960s. What are we getting out of this?
Sort of like a negative perspective from a woman, that, you know, just how bad it is to be forced into these castes, the roles that they're like forced into.
Yep. So obviously you would need to know what a caste system is. For those of you that don't remember this from maybe the first time you ever heard this would have been in world history in 9th grade when you talked about India. A caste system is the idea that when you're born, you're placed into a certain level of society. You know, some people are born into the wealthiest caste and others are going to be poor no matter what they do. Okay. Their social class is dictated based upon who they were born. And keep in mind that this also comes out of England as well. If you're born, you know, if I have a son and I'm Lord so-and-so of such and such, then he's going to be the next Lord so-and-so of such and such. You know, that's his place, regardless of whether or not I actually have the money to keep up the lifestyle. He still gets that title. Okay. So what are they really talking about here is women are automatically from birth placed into an idea that you cannot lead, that you cannot be the spokesperson, that you cannot do what men do. So what is the argument here? Even in, notice, the peace and civil rights movement, the key terminology here is hierarchy. Hierarchy means that there's somebody at the top, somebody underneath them, somebody underneath them, somebody underneath them. So what are we getting out of this? Even in social movements. And when we're talking about peace in 1965, we're talking about Vietnam, okay? The early stages of Vietnam. So even in the peace movement of people who are protesting Vietnam, and even in the civil rights movement, whether it be for women, whether it be for African Americans, whether it be for Latino workers, whoever they're talking about when it comes to social movements in 1965, women are not the spokesperson. They're not the leaders. If you think about it, if you look at the civil rights movement, and I was to say, hey, 1960 civil rights movement, name the leaders, you would take a while to get to any female leader of the civil rights movement. And of course, some people would immediately be like, no, Rosa Parks. Was Rosa Parks really one of the outspoken people? No, she led by example. And I'm not selling her short, but that was in 1955. Who then rose to lead the bus boycott? It wasn't Rosa Parks. It was Martin Luther King Jr. Okay. Malcolm X led his own movement. Stokely Carmichael led his own movement within the African-American community for civil rights. There were not too many women that were doing the same thing. So, and look, even in the women's rights movement, if I was to say, who were the leaders of the women's rights movement? Name me the leaders of the feminist movement. It's not as widely reported. It would take you a while to get to names like Gloria Steinem, a name that many of you have never heard because you didn't watch my videos. I know they're boring. I know. So, needless to say, when they're talking about this hierarchies, even in these social movements that are pushing for a change to society, they're not practicing what they preach. Okay, so it's somewhat a condemnation of these movements that, yeah, you say you're doing it, but in reality, no. To bring it up to modern day examples, imagine the environmentalist movement if Greta Thunberg or Al Gore were taking private planes everywhere and driving to their speaking engagements in huge Humvees and, you know, massive SUVs and stuff like that, and not worrying about gasoline, not worrying about the fuel expectations, and then going on stage with their own personal electronic devices just plugged in everywhere. And then they get up and say, hey, we need to be a little bit more green. We need to save the planet. Nobody would take them serious. That would be a complete and total hypocrisy, okay? That if that were actually happening, that would be hypocritical to the extreme. That's what they're saying here is, hey, you're being just as hypocritical because you're saying women have to be equal. Women have to be equal, but you're not letting them speak. And you're not putting them in roles of power, okay? Document 4. Source, Robin Morgan and the New York Radical Women press release, No More Miss America, 1968. Believe it or not, there was a protest against the Miss America pageant, okay? And this happened during the 1960s. This women's group absolutely pushed for a kind of suspension or a complete and total getting rid of the Miss America pageant. Okay, and of course, this was their press release. So what is the source? The New York Radical Women. Okay, and just by their name alone, you know that they are on the outskirts of the movement. Okay, for immediate release on September 7th in Atlantic City, which is in New Jersey, the annual Miss America pageant will again crown, quote, your ideal. But this year, reality will liberate the contest auction block in the guise of guillaume deplasticized breathing women, women of every political persuasion. All are invited to join us in a day-long boardwalk theater event. We will protest the image of Miss America, an image that oppresses women in every area in which it purports to represent us. There will be picket lines, guerrilla theater, leafleting, lobbying visits to the contestants, urging our sisters to reject the pageant farce and join us, a huge freedom trash can into which we will throw bras, girdles, curlers, false eyelashes, wigs, and representative issues of Cosmopolitan, Ladies' Home Journal, Family Circle, etc. Bring any such women garbage you have around the house. We will also announce a boycott of all those commercial products related to the pageant. It should be a groovy day on the boardwalk in the sun with our sisters. In case of arrests, however, we plan to reject all male authority and demand to be busted by police women only. Male chauvinist reactionaries on this issue had best stay away, nor are male liberals welcome in the demonstrations, but sympathetic men can donate money as well as cars and drivers. Male reporters will be refused interviews. We reject patronizing reportage. Only newswomen will be recognized. So this was the plan for an actual march and huge protest, if you will, of the Miss America pageant, which did happen. They did have people run up and throw bras and throw girdles. And why were they doing that? Because they actually believed that those were a symbol of women being, for lack of better terminology, restrained. That they were restraining women from just being themselves. And this is at a time period where for the first time you heard people saying, well, how is it that men can go to the beach, take their shirt off, and run around in just a pair of shorts, but a woman has to cover up? You know, why is it that women have to do that? Why is it women have extra things they need to get done? Okay, why is it that they have certain items that men don't have to worry about? You know, if this were truly an equal society, no one would look down if a woman said, you know what, I'm going braless. That's it. You know what, I'm not wearing a girdle anymore. No, you know what, I'm not putting makeup on. I'm not doing anything extra that a guy would not have to do. So this is kind of what they're protesting at this point. And they're protesting, of course, at this point, back during this time period, the Miss America pageant. It was, you know, you had to wear an evening gown, you had to wear a swimsuit, you had to parade around in front of the cameras. This is what the women were talking about. And of course, if you talk to the Miss America pageant, they talk about how they are a scholarship, opportunity for these women, that they're promoting women's education, that they're promoting women, leaving the house and doing different things. These people are saying that is not the way to do it. If you're going to promote women, then how come we have to parade around in clothing, you know, like the evening gown and the swimsuit and stuff, and only part of the competition is us being asked a question, you know? So they're certainly going after that. Again, this protest did happen, and they did have people arrested, and they refused to go to jail, being arrested by male police officers, okay? And of course, the point of view of that document, if you're looking at it, they're obviously against materialistic women. They're basically saying, and that goes along with, if you don't know the magazine's Cosmopolitan, Cosmopolitan was all about what to wear, what look is in, how women can attract men, that type of stuff. Ladies' Home Journal, it's talking about, what best recipes to cook, how best to clean your house. The Family Circle, how best to parent. How do you discipline your children? How do you raise them properly? How do you send them to school? What's the best way to do it? All that. They're saying all those traditional roles of being a woman need to be thrown out. Okay, so their point of view is that the traditional family role of a woman is no longer applicable. All right, document 5. Myrta Vidal, Women, New Voice of La Raza, 1971. The awakening of Chicana consciousness has been prompted by the machismo she encounters in the movement. This behavior is a serious obstacle to women anxious to play a role in the struggle for Chicano liberation. The oppression suffered by Chicanas is different from that suffered by most women in this country. Because Chicanas are part of an oppressed nationality, they are subjected to the racism practiced against La Raza. Since the overwhelming majority of Chicanos are workers, Chicanas are also victims of the exploitation of the working class. But in addition, Chicanas are relegated to an inferior position because of their sex. Thus, Raza women suffer a triple form of oppression. Because sexism and male chauvinism are so deeply rooted in this society, there is a strong tendency to deny the basic right of Chicanas to organize around their own concrete issues. Instead, they are told to stay away from the women's liberation movement because it is a Anglo thing. All right, so Myrta Vidal, obviously, if we're talking about Chicana, we are talking about people from what area? This is not a typical term from this time period. It's changed. Anyone want to take a guess? Go ahead. Chris, go ahead.
Latin America.
This would be, yes. So this is before they would call Latina. Okay. So when we're talking about the Latino and Latina movement, what is she really saying? Myrta is, of course, the source here. Okay. From 1971, you're talking about not only, and what is she saying is, hey, by our modern day terminology, Latino women are being hurt just as much as any other female. Okay, but she's arguing they're being hurt more. Okay, and what is the point of view? The women's rights movement, she's pointing out, is not for all women. It's the white women want their place. We're not welcome in that. So she's saying it's a trifecta. I'm not allowed in because I am Latina. Okay, that because of my race, I'm being hurt within the workforce. I'm not being allowed in because I'm a woman, and then I'm not being allowed in to the women's movement because I'm a Latin woman. So she's like, I've got 3 levels of oppression before I even get started. Okay, so and you're talking about in 1965, they're saying, hey, let's protest the Miss America pageant. In 1971, 6 years later, this woman's saying, hey, I got to protest the women's rights movement because they're not following what I want them to do. Okay, so it's another level, if you will, of this women's rights movement. It's criticizing not just the difference between men and women, but also women of different ethnicities. Document 6, source, United States Congress, Title IX, Education Amendments, 1972. All right, so Title IX. This one is a direct source. So if you're talking about what is the source, it is the Congress. This is a bill from Congress. And Title IX was all about equality of opportunities between men and women. Okay. And it says, no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to the discrimination under any education program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So what does this mean? I can no longer tell a woman who doesn't want to take home ec and would much rather take wood shop. I can no longer say, well, women take home ec, men take wood shop. If our school is getting federal funds, a woman can sign up for whatever classes she wants. If a female comes in to schedule her classes and says, but I don't want to take animal care, I want to take AP chemistry, I can't say, well, girls don't typically do that. Now, of course, in 2020 here, you would think that if I advised you to do something based upon your gender, you would think that to be completely wrong. Now, why? Because in 1972, they made that illegal. And over time, we have adjusted as a society to make sure that that doesn't happen. Okay. Title IX also extends to sports. So if you haven't noticed, there are an equal or at least comparable amount of men's sports to female sports in all schools. Because if you get federal funding, you cannot deny that based upon gender. You can't say, hey, guess what? You don't have the opportunity to play that sport because you're a girl. Okay. If anybody does that, the school can be sued. Okay. The same thing holds true with equipment, with facilities. If I say as an athletic director, if I was the athletic director of a school and I said, all right, the football team needs a massive locker room to themselves, and then we're going to have a male locker room for all the other sports and a male locker room for PE classes, and the girls are just going to have one big locker room to themselves. Females could sue the school because they're not given the same facilities. They're not getting a comparable amount of facilities. So I would have to, as an athletic director, make sure that if I have 3 male locker rooms, that I would have 3 female locker rooms. I would have to make sure that they are exactly the same, because Title IX makes it very clear that you cannot have a better version or a bigger version without offering it comparable to the other gender. So Title IX was put in place in Document 6 in 1972 in order to do that. And of course, this is kind of getting at the idea of education, but it was more than that. Okay. And then finally, Document 7. And by the way, the point of view, and this is where students always mess this up. It's a government document. Every single time the government does this and extends right, what is the point of view of it? It's that the government realizes there's a problem. Okay. The government's admitting that they made a mistake, or that there's a new social problem that they have to correct. Okay. So the point of view is the government's admitting mistakes. The government is admitting that there needs to be a change. Document 7, as you see, is an image of a crowd at a reproductive rights demonstration in Pittsburgh of 1974. Okay. The right to choose. Okay. The right to choose is the right to refuse. Okay. All right. Let's come down to it. What is this one about? What is this picture trying to tell us? What are we choosing, folks? Okay, either you're asleep or you're too afraid, or you haven't figured out how to unmute. Folks, this is about abortion. 1974, Roe v. Wade. Okay, this is a protest about reproductive rights. This is in the early stages of the pill. Okay, the pill being prescribed to women to avoid pregnancy. So this is the very early stages of birth control. But in 1974, Roe v. Wade passed through the Supreme Court in a very controversial decision that allowed for abortion to take place within the United States. This is a protest saying that women should have the right to choose, and by extension, the right to refuse, that women should have the right and control of the right to control their own bodies. That is what this picture is promoting. Now, of course, front and center is a man, you know, standing there showing obviously that he's, you know, supporting these women. But in the DBQ, what can we glean from this? We can talk about how men were participating in this as well, but sometimes they weren't welcomed in either. And what are we really talking about? If we go all the way back to the question, explain the causes of the rise of women's rights movement in the period of 1940 to 1975. What are they really talking about here? It's not a clear-cut progression. It's not like this crescendoed up without its problems. Okay, so you got some of the documents here saying we don't want men at all to be part of this. We got some of the documents saying that men are preventing women from being part of this. And the last one is you got a picture of both genders standing there calling out for the same thing. So you have a mixed message movement. Okay, there is a mixed message movement to it in that 35-year time span. Okay, now that being said, are there any questions on any of the documents?
Wouldn't document 6 also work in the reverse if, like, say, men weren't allowed to join a girls' sport?
You can make that argument. You can make the argument that the Title IX verbiage wasn't clear. You can make the argument that the Title IX verbiage was meant to solve a problem, by extension caused a different problem. And of course, you could make the argument in the modern day that is it a clear-cut thing to say that you cannot stop something based on gender? Gender is one of those words become awfully confusing over the past 10 years or so.
Yeah.
Okay, so because of that, you have a change. I mean, it illustrates the fact that things have changed over time within the United States.
Well, it's just one of those things because it feels like everyone calls attention to if, say, a girl is pressured out of doing a sport that mostly guys do, but at the same time, there are guys that I know that wouldn't join, say, volleyball because it's typically a girl's sport.
Yeah, so you do have a mixed message there. There is a mixed message. So keep in mind that goes along with what I was saying, that this was not a generalized, very simple, easy timeline amplifying up. This could be very, very controversial all the way through. Okay. Now, I'm going to quickly take over your computer screens again. So don't mind me real quick here. I'm going to take over because I want you to see. All right. So this worksheet, we've gone through the 7 documents here. Down here, the background info, the staplered method. Okay. Or the stapled method. This was something that was brought to my attention a long time ago. You never have to use these methods that I present to you, but it's a good idea to try them every now and then. This was a teacher that I met at a conference. They used this. They had been teaching AP for a very long time. To get their background info, instead of just having like a blanket, all right, well, what else was going on during this time period? You have a 1940 to 1975 time period, okay? What this teacher did is they said, what were the social, the technological, the artistic, the political, the legal, the economic, and the diplomatic things that were going on at the same time, all right? Now, this is where I'm going to actually go through, and I'm going to show you exactly how to fill this out, all right? So the question is asking from 1940 to 1975, okay? That 35-year time span. Politically, FDR was president, Truman was president, Eisenhower, JFK, LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, and Nixon were all president during that time period. All right. Now, why am I writing that out? So I know which presidential administrations I'm discussing. So I know exactly which presidents I could reference during my answer. Okay. This helps you to bring in outside information if you can remember this. Okay. Economically, we were recovering from the Great Depression. We then had a World War II economy. We then had the baby boom. And arms race during the Cold War, which, as we mentioned before, is capitalism versus communism. So those were the economic things going on during that time period. Legally, 1940 to 1975, Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated the schools, happened in 1954. I just mentioned it. Roe v. Wade happened in 1974. Okay? And that had to do with abortion. Okay? So legally, the Supreme Court was involved during that time period and had two landmark cases, amongst others, but these were the ones that were applicable to what we're talking about. Artistically, 1940s, 1950s. In the 1950s, you had the rise of rock and roll. You then had the rise during the 60s of the hippies, what is known as the counter culture. And by the end of the 1960s, you had the Woodstock Festival. Of course, you could go into artistic, I'm only talking about music here, but you could talk about the rise of television. You could talk about the movies of the time period. You could talk about anything that would be considered art or, let's be honest, pop culture. Okay. Technologically, during that time period, like I said, it flows into it. Television becomes a big deal during the 50s and the early 60s. Okay. You have the rise of the interstate highway system under Eisenhower. The space race against the Soviets. And of course, you have the nuclear age, where we can blow up the entire Earth multiple times over. Socially, civil rights movement. Obviously, the women's rights movement. And of course, you have 1950s, what is known as button-up culture, where everybody is supposed to look the same, act the same, whatever else. And some people called this the age of conformity. And the easiest way to understand this, I don't know, this would probably be your grandparents' generation. If you look back at their yearbook, every woman is wearing the same basic type of, they had the same basic hairstyle. They had the same basic dress. They had the same basic, pearl necklace type mentality. The guys all had the same haircut. They all wore white shirts with black ties. If you look at our yearbooks now, they're nowhere close to what they were during your grandparents' generation, or even before that. So 1950s, that age of conformity, nobody could look different, okay? That then led to the hippie movement. Sexual revolution, and drug culture during the 1960s. And why was that all happening? Because Vietnam happened, and young people rebelled in multiple ways. That leads us into diplomatic. What was happening on the foreign front? Front and center is Vietnam, but even before that, we're talking about World War II, the Korean conflict, the Cold War, and then, of course, Vietnam. Okay, all of those would have background information associated with it. Now, I could go way in depth with this, but what am I really doing with this background info? I'm doing it quickly so that I can frame my time period, so that I know what I can reference as I'm going through and answering the question. What can I glean from the outside that would influence this? Okay, that would help me to answer the question over women's rights. Okay, now, of course, the question, again, out of this was explain the causes of the rise of the women's rights movement in the period of 1940 to 1975. Okay? That's what they're asking me, the causes. All right? So they're actually helping you to do this. Supporting argument number 1, supporting argument number 2, supporting argument number 3. What are some of the causes? Okay? if I look back at my documents, they actually help me pave the way. Document 1 is going to give me the fact, and I'm going to use Doc 1 here, is going to give me the argument, women began to work outside of the household. Okay. Then in document 2, it said women starting working outside of the household. You can use document 2 to talk about how many are working. You can talk about how much money they're making. You can talk about the hierarchical system here. But here I might say document 2 and 3 women working outside the home caused economic issues and social changes. Okay. Because both of those we're talking about the hierarchy and the payment. Okay. Document 4, I can go back and say, okay, so my supporting argument is being supported by these 2 documents. Now, what kind of argument can I make out of this? Okay, so the argument, women were invited by the government to participate in the workforce and then expected to vanish back into the traditional role of women during the 1950s. Now, how can I use that? Women being invited, obviously, by propaganda. But then document 4, notice they mention the magazines. Ladies' Home Journal, Cosmopolitan, whatever else. I can revert that back to, hey, those magazines were talking about what women were supposed to do in the 1950s by returning back to those traditional roles. That's not happening. So supporting argument number 1 is bolstered by documents 1 and 4. Document 2 and 3, the argument and you have the documents that would back you up on that. Okay, women would be being treated unequally in the workplace by men and the expectations of job placement and economic salary scales. Okay, then I've got document 5 here talking about the issues. Document 6 and 7. can make the argument without a clear message, and that's a little redundant. I would fix this, obviously, but without a clear message from a leader, the movement still accomplished some of the goals, but had trouble clarifying their overall, and I would find a different word for message, maybe goals or accomplishment, maybe. And I could even at that point include one of the accomplishments here. I could even use document 6 here with Title IX. That was an accomplishment of the actual movement. But outside information, I could maybe talk about the glass ceiling effect. And the glass ceiling effect is the idea that women can see the job they want, but they can't get to it. There's something there's a barrier that is preventing their movement upwards, but they can't get through it. And this was something that was brought up in 2016 when Donald Trump won the presidency, and people said, well, why is it that Hillary Clinton lost in the states she lost that were battleground states like Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania? There were a number of women that voted in those states that said they just weren't ready to see a female president. Now, that's women saying they weren't ready to see somebody that looks like them become president, that they were just used to seeing a man, and that's just the way it is. Now, you can argue, of course, back and forth as to whether or not that's fine and whether or not that's a legitimate argument. Either way, there is a glass ceiling effect there, that there were women that were preventing other women from succeeding. Okay. And of course, you could utilize a number of different things. You could include anything in that, but that would be an outside effect where, yes, they have Title IX, but what are they doing with it? Okay. The final step is you would need to write a thesis statement. If these are my arguments, what would a thesis statement be? Well, if my arguments is that women were invited by the government to participate in the workforce and then expected to vanish back in the traditional roles, women were being treated unequally in the workplace by men, and then without a clear message from a leader, the movement still accomplished some goals. Okay. Remember what they're actually asking here. They are basically saying, in a very simple way, explain the causes of the civil right or the rise of women's rights movement in the period of 1940 to 1975. Okay. Now, by doing this, the women's rights movement began to take root in the mid-1900s post-World War II society due to the focus on social and economic changes to America by utilizing their political powers gained by the 19th Amendment. That is the women's right to vote, women's suffrage. I'm clearly showing a connectivity to an earlier fight, the suffragette movement. I'm making it very clear that I understand the difference. And I'm then supporting my argument by talking about these are all economic issues. Okay. Now, can I then rework this thesis statement to include things like it wasn't a clear message or it had some successes? I can, but that's kind of where you start from. Okay. So this is, again, your 7 different documents, which we just went through, the background info, your thesis, your supporting arguments, and then I can even start saying, all right, well, what am I going to use from here that will help me other than the glass ceiling effect I put in here, okay? You could even put in here, or I'm sorry, in supporting arguments right here, women began to work outside the household, women's roles began to change. This is the baby boom generation. That's right. Okay, boomer. This is where they get their start. If the baby boom generation, and the baby boom generation, by the way, was post-World War II, so it was 1946, technically to 1954, but it was longer than that. But the baby boom in itself is this time period. Well, if you fast forward to when these kids are growing up to be 20 years old, you're talking about 1966 to 1974. And isn't that the time period of the feminist movement? So the daughters of the women that went to go be stenographers are now going to say, well, it was good enough for mom to leave the house and have a job during World War II. And yes, mom may have gone back in the house, and she might have raised 2 kids and had 2.5 cars and had a white picket fence house out in the suburbs. Mom may have been okay with that, but daughter is not. Okay, so the baby boom generation could be used here to talk about the expectations of women, that women were not okay with that after growing up. If you're talking about being treated unequally in the workplace, looking back through here, you could easily draw comparisons and parallels to the civil rights movement here. Okay, you could talk about economic inequalities. Because yes, women are being treated unequal at the workforce. So were African Americans. Okay, so you could easily draw a comparison there. Okay, you could even talk about the counterculture, the hippie movement, the Woodstock Festival. Okay, because here's the thing, if you're talking about having a clear message from a leader, you could bring up Janis Joplin. You could bring up Joan Baez. You could bring up any of the women that were singers during that time period who were calling for a change to American society. So again, all of this can, be helpful, hopefully. Take it off presentation mode here. That's what you're trying to do here. Okay, you're trying to differentiate. Now, keep in mind this time around, you're only going to have 5 documents to go through, not 7. Okay. And the stapler method, as I was trying to show you there, is not supposed to be an in-depth thing where you look up everything. It's just, what do I remember from that time period? And that way you can look at the chart real quick and say, all right, what do I need? What do I need to answer this question? What can I fit in that's outside information that would actually help my argument? Okay. So again, all I'm trying to do with this one is model for you how this works. This is not meant to be anything that, I expect you to do just off the cuff and be able to get done. It's just something that I'm trying to model for you so that you feel more comfortable moving forward. All right, questions? All right, so here's the deal, folks. The DBQ thing that I just was filling out there, I need you to fill out your own, okay? And you can feel free to copy what I put down. You can feel free to do that, okay? This time around was just a participation. You're getting 50 points for participating. All I need you to do is fill out this document that I was just going through and submit it. That's all I need you to do. That's 50 points right there. From now on, when I post a DBQ, and a due date, the due date's going to be when we have one of these. And if you can make the DBQ session, that's fine. If you can't, again, I'm going to try and record it and then post it so that you can watch it if you can't make it at the 2 o'clock time frame or whenever. And I'll try and have some in the evening too, if that's easier. And again, you can always swing by in the morning when I have office hours. Some of you have done that. All I'm asking you to do is fill these out, and that way you can kind of get more practice in how the process works. And I'll switch it up from time to time. I'll use different methodologies. Stapled is one way. There's about 300 different ways you can utilize as well. And if you find a method that you like better, you can just substitute it on those. You can take your form and say, I'm not doing this. If you like stapled, if you're like, you know what, I get this one, I'm going to do that one every single time. That's how I'm going to do it. Whatever method I post there, you don't have to do that method. You can switch it out for something else. Okay. Or if you have your own method of getting outside information or framing the argument, again, that's your call. So you can play with these documents as much as you want. All I'm asking you to do is go through the process and show me where your head's at. Okay? All right. So it looks like I still have Sears, Hughes, Osborne, Harmon, Bungabong, Meese, Baker, Davies, and Hassan. So that means I'm missing Blackwell today, Hunter, Adams, Slayton, and I'm missing Hines, Jones, Morris, and Siddharth. Okay. So these are not required. You don't need to show up to these things. Okay. If you can't make it or you just don't feel like it, and I promise we'll be quicker the next time. I apologize for the length of this one, but the people that I mentioned, reach out to them. I still need to know whether or not Hines, Jones, Morris, and Siddharth are taking the AP exam. So if those are friends of yours and you can text them, please reach out to them and say, hey, you forgot to write an email to V. Please take care of that ASAP, because I have to let the guidance office know what the intentions are. Everybody who's here obviously is doing the AP test, so these are going to be your assignments all the way up to and through the AP test. It's just getting you ready for that test. And again, it's not, quite honestly, it's meant to be an easy grade for you. It's still practice, but I'm not trying to kill you with this kind of stuff. All right. So again, if you are friends with Hines, Jones, Morris, and Siddharth, reach out to them, ask them, hey, are you taking the exam? And if you are, reach out to V and say, yes, no, maybe so, whatever. Okay. Other than that, I'll hang back if you have questions. I'm every morning at office hours from 9 to noon. So feel free to swing by and ask questions then if you need it, or just say hi. And again, I'll post another DBQ coming up here probably end of the week, and then we'll have one of these little powwows next week, probably Tuesday would be my guess. All right, folks, the DBQ, I'd like this by the end of the week. By Friday, I'd like you to have this worksheet done. Most of you are following along, should be done already. And again, you can feel free to copy and paste what I put in there, but please make sure that you you take the time to get it done and turn it in. I will post this one. Actually, I'll just share it. All right. I'm going to share this to your school email account, what I have written down. Right. I'm going to share this to your school email address so you have the copy that I had. You can cut and paste how you see fit. But you are free to go. Again, if you have questions, you can hang back. Thank you for paying attention as long as you did, or at least pretending, and we'll see you later.